Four hostages, four kidnappees have been rescued.
You saw the elation of Israeli society to finally hear some good news. Really shows success story in the sense that the IDF, when they have solid, good intelligence, they get the job done. And this was done in broad daylight. The unfortunate that the commander of the SWAT team who led this died of his wounds as a result of the operation. The Arab world, of course, at Hamas, of course, is they want to focus on what they perceive to be human casualties as a result of the IDF going into Nuseirat and into Gaza in general. These are where they're trying to deflect from the reality. As the IDF was rescuing these hostages, they were firing at them. There is a very different timetable that Washington and Jerusalem have.
I have such a special guest this morning as we talk about some developments in the Middle East and in Israel. Asaf Warmarowski is with Scholars for Peace in the Middle East and the Association for the Study for the Middle East in Africa. Asaf, welcome. Great to see you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Good morning.
So the first thing that we have to talk about, four hostages, four kidnappees have been rescued by the IDF. Noa Argamani, Shlomi Ziv, Andrey Kozlov, and Almog Meir. What do you know about this rescue? But first, let's talk about the emotional part of it, how people are feeling around the world and what the reaction is.
Yeah, look, I think it's amazing. I mean, you saw the reactions on social media. There's a tweet that is trending now about a lifeguard in Israel that announced on the beaches of Israel, and you saw the elation of Israeli society to finally hear some good news. Noa Argamani, as you know so well, was the individual who was filmed getting kidnapped on the motorcycle from the Nova Festival. Her face has been, depicted all over the place, and so people know who she is. She's also the same individual whose mother is really in critical care on her last days, and her last wish was to see her daughter alive. So it's a tremendously emotional day. But also really shows success story in the sense that the IDF, when they have solid, good intelligence, they get the job done. And this was done in broad daylight. This was done in Nuseirat, which is an area that the IDF really has no prior intel in that area. It's near, Jabalia refugee camp. It's another refugee camp. And so it was tremendous to see the success story. The unfortunate that the commander of the SWAT team who led this died of his wounds as a result of the operation. But the sense in Israel that they needed a moral win to bring back is, of course, critical. The Arab world, of course, at Hamas, of course, is, poo-pooing all of this, to say the least. The reactions were, of course, that they want to focus on what they perceive to be as the human casualties as a result of the IDF going into Nuseirat and into Gaza in general. And so these are where they're trying to deflect from the reality. Obviously, the reactions by Hamas are very clear. As the IDF was rescuing these hostages, they were firing at them. So very telling about how they feel and how they've used and abused these very hostages for the very purposes they were taken.
And this comes on the heel of Hamas not agreeing to a ceasefire agreement or some sort of exchange agreement that would bring us closer to the end of the war. I have to ask you, I've also heard that these kidnappees were found in the homes of Gazan citizens.
Yeah, I mean, that's, again, another critical point. The fact that Gazan population, the civilian population, has been working hand in hand and been complacent with Hamas. They're the same individuals who were destroying skulls and they were giving out candy, and the elation when every hostage was brought back into Gaza. They were embedded in the civilian population in these homes. And so, when you talk about the quote unquote innocence in Gaza, when you see actual participation, we cannot forget, your listeners should not forget that the Gaza population elected Hamas back in 2006. Hamas was seen as the positive change and as the counter to the Palestinian Authority. So it's really hard to, when you talk about the viewpoints, when they talk about attitudes, as far as how they feel about Hamas population, you can exactly see how this plays out. The population sees Hamas as a feature of their viewpoints, represents them, attitudes and trends, and they are willing to work with them. And the fact that when Hamas says, let's work together and let's kidnap Israelis, let's abuse them, they are willing to step up to the plate, and they have done so. I mean, and so civilian population has definitely been complacent with the attacks, and we should definitely take that into consideration. Again, not really reported on, not really dissected. You know, there is a perception that Hamas are these they are separate from Palestinian society. They're not. And they represent a huge swatch of Palestinian society, ideologically, culturally, and politically.
What do scholars for the peace in the Middle East think about or know about the feeling about Hamas now? Is the population still in favor of Hamas, or are they just unable to speak out against them?
Look, SPME represents at large a wide variety of opinions. What binds us together is the fact that we all believe in Israel's right to exist. Israel is a democracy, and we have individuals riding from different political persuasions. One of the main things that we have come together to combat has been the boycott against Israeli institutions and academics, and the fact that we combat BDS and anti-Semitism. I think that in general, what we've seen on American college campuses post 10/7 is the absolute unbelievable outpouring of support for Hamas's barbaric actions on American college campuses, whereas faculty and students are willing to support terrorism. After we've seen the horrific barbaric reality of what Hamas does in the name of so-called academic freedom. This is not academic freedom. These are active terrorists. And so there's a lot of, to my mind, introspective and questioning that needs to happen within these very institutions that we so much care about as far as Western values and attitudes, and the kind of messages that they're putting out there in their active support for Hamas, which is no different than Al-Qaeda, and no different than Ansar al-Islam, than Hezbollah, than any of the other groups that are out there, these Islamist groups. This is the Muslim Brotherhood in America, and their objectives and goals are to kill Jews and Christians. They are anti-Western, they are anti-American, which is antithetical to the very institutions that are supposed to be safeguarding these very values.
Well, let's talk about this anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas activity on college campuses and around the world. What kind of impact has that had on the process to end this war?
To my mind, Israel is fighting a war on three fronts. You're fighting the war on the ground that cannot be lost. You're fighting the war outside of the patrons who supported this war. And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about countries that supported actively and funded the war, really the ones who are Hamas's patrons. And that has to do with groups states like Iran, Turkey, Malaysia, Lebanon. Can't forget the Qataris, who have all been sponsoring actively these very, everything that Hamas has been able to do has not happened in a vacuum. They have funded this activity. And American and European college campuses, which have been putting out this very consistent synonymous narrative to the Hamas narrative on American college campuses, with the sole goal of winning the hearts and minds of Western society. It is no coincidence that already on October 9th, on October 10th, you had campuses like Berkeley were giving out toolkits by organizations like the SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, telling them exactly how to activate and mobilize the campus exactly for the sole reason of support for Hamas. When you have messages on social media by Hamas leaders thanking American college campuses for their active support and for showing their support for what they believe to be as injustice, versus justice, and what's going on these campuses. These are all the trigger words that has been playing into the American college campus. So when you look at the stats and the latest pollings of the younger generation of Americans, that individuals between 17 and 24 believe 100% that Israel's in the wrong and Hamas is in the right, it's no surprise when these are exactly the mills that are perpetuating this very narrative. And it is detached from reality. It is afactual. It is ahistorical. They don't know where Gaza is, and they wouldn't know where it was, the majority of these kids, if it was there was a map in front of them. And you also have to put into consideration the individuals who have been funding these encampments that we've been seeing over the past few months on the campuses, and the ideological narrative that they put out there. They're coming from groups like, Soros, or coming from groups who support BDS, foundations like Westpac and the Tides Foundation. You have individuals who have been involved in Occupy Wall Street. They are professional agitators who are using the American college campus to hijack this very narrative, trying to turn America on its head. And that's where it's nefarious, that's where it's insidious. And that's where we have to my mind, take back the campus and establish clear red lines of what our institutions are supposed to be doing when it comes to education, pedagogy, inquisitive research, curiosity, for that matter, all the things that I'm having a very difficult time finding these days in my travels on campuses and what I've observed in the past 8+ months.
I understand now that Congress is investigating SJP and AMB, for having financial ties to Hamas and other Islamist terror groups. What do you know about that? What do you know about the trail of paperwork that led them to this conclusion?
So there is a lot of evidence that showcases the ties between the American Muslims for Palestine and SJP. They are not linked, but there is similarities as far as outreach, organizational leadership. There's overlapping individuals and their conventions and conferences. And a lot of this is stemming from data that goes back to the days after 9/11, the Holy Land Foundation, as far as individuals who were involved in charities that were raising money for Hamas. And what we found today is that there is similar information and similar parallel movements and parallel activity between these two organizations. And predominantly SJP has been a springboard for disseminating information on these college campuses at large. And this is where a lot of this is coming from, and what has allowed the Attorney General in Virginia in particular and Arizona to open up a case as far as support for terror on campus. That, compounded with what, has been happening in Congress, investigation of terror money that is coming to American college campuses, as far as what exactly, where are the red lines when it comes to violation of foreign money, foreign students who are coming in with foreign ideologies. What are these campuses are exactly putting out there? We literally saw during the encampment at Columbia, the wife of an individual by the name of Sami El-Arian, who was arrested and evicted out of the United States for direct ties to the PFLP, who was a professor at South Florida, who regularly meets with Hamas. His son-in-law is a professor on American college campuses. His wife was part of the encampment at Columbia. So we have active individuals who have direct ties to terrorism, which should be very telling and consequential enough to understand exactly what we're dealing with when it comes to dissecting the American college campus today, and what I would define as these tentifadas and Hamas in America, and exactly what the messages are being coming out from them, calling for from the river to the sea, calling for intifadas, calling for a destruction of Israel. I mean, just to contextualize it, Israel has been seen as a white colonial settler project. And so the immediate response right after 10/7 was that if that is indeed the case, which they 100% believe in, then the immediate reaction is this is decolonialism, which is why it is justified. And that is the exact message that you saw coming out of faculty, We have individuals who were saying how awesome this was, quote unquote. They were elated. They were invigorated, and they made all these comments on social media and everywhere else to stand by Hamas.
You want to real quick just set the record straight here?
So, yes, Israel is not a colonial project. Zionism is Jewish nationalism. Israel goes back to its roots back in biblical times. The creation of the modern state of Israel is a return of the Jewish people to the state of Israel. Historically speaking, it's important to note that Jews and Zionists especially who came to Israel in the early 20s and 30s, were looking for collaboration and for looking for coexistence with the Arab population. That is fact. The Arab-Palestinian Muslim narrative argues and has been arguing that Israel came and eradicated and pushed out people and moved them out of a country that wasn't theirs, and they had no ties to the land. It could be nothing but further from the truth. The fact of the matter is that the so-called existence of Arab Palestinian refugees post-1948-49 was because they were told to leave. They were actually said, leave. Once we eradicate what they define as the Zionist entity, you come back to your homes. They had a predetermined outcome to this reality. When that reality did not come to fruition, that's how they predominantly became refugees. And it is exactly that point in time where the Arab world understood the so-called opportunity and where they've used this opportunity to argue that the maintenance and the existence of Arab Palestinian refugees in perpetuity is going to be a constant reminder of 1948, what the Arab Muslim world defines as, in the Arab Palestinian narrative, defines as the Nakba, the catastrophe of Israel's existence. And so really for that reason alone, with the exception of Jordan, no Arab country has ever afforded the Palestinian citizenship to keep them as a symbolism, as a token of the reality of 1948. It's also important to note that those Arabs who stayed throughout the war itself are indeed the Arab Israelis, which shows another case study where coexistence has existed and the Arab Israelis are part of the fabric of Israeli society and represented in the Israeli Knesset. That is the factual reality versus the propaganda that is being sold on, I would say, a large majority of American college campuses and European ones today.
Okay, let's move on and talk about Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's expected visit to a joint session of Congress on July 24th. What should we expect to see, and what kind of an impact will that have on the war?
Look, Netanyahu has yet to have an official visit to the United States since he was last elected to the premiership. Netanyahu, as you know, is the longest sitting prime minister Israel has ever had. He has not had an official visit at the White House. The fact that he has been invited, I would say positively, not with, there was a lot of work that went into this by both parties to come and address Congress is critical. I think that he needs to come and obviously share what's happening on the ground. There are a lot of challenges, in particular within the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the attitudes that you talk about on how they perceive Israel to be. The same individuals who were against the war to begin with and have a great deal of pro-Palestinian sympathy led by members of the Squad, Tlaib, Omar, AOC, and others. I'm sure that those viewpoints will be on display during Netanyahu's visit, and they will use this as an opportunity to try to protest his talk all around. That being said, positively, I would argue that the majority of American society, of Congress, supports Israel's right to exist, supports Israel's right to self-defense, as we've seen by the ongoing support of the United States towards Israel. There's been, again, not without challenges. So here we are 8 months plus since the war began. Netanyahu will take this opportunity to make, to my mind, the correct case that the war that Israel is fighting, that Israel's war is also America's war. And you have to put this into context, that all of the players that have been involved in this war are part of the Iranian axis. and their sentiment and their viewpoints towards Israel are synonymous towards their viewpoints towards America and the West. And so the argument is going to be very simple, as it was in a very similar fashion, after 9/11, that Al-Qaeda and Hamas are one and the same. These are the same kind of ideologies that are out to destroy, hurt Americans and Israelis alike. And I think that it is critical that Israel needs to win this war. And notwithstanding electoral politics here in the States, and for that matter, I would say, whatever happens in Israel when it comes to, elections in Israel, whenever they come about as well. The U.S.-Israel relationship and the fabric of it, historically speaking, has been rooted in a bipartisan support. I think that the political toxicity has pushed us in many, many different directions, but I think it's critical to get back to basics and to remind both allies what we're fighting for and the significance and importance of the alliance.
Speaking of the Israeli government, there's been some talk about some of the coalition not agreeing with how to proceed with this war. Is there a possibility that there could be a new government coalition during this war?
It's hard to say. Apropos today's operation that resulted in bringing back safely 4 Israeli hostages, one of the demands of Benny Gantz, who was making a lot of political noise about leaving the government, was the condition of bringing back more hostages. Whether or not this changes his decision post today's operation is yet to be seen. I think that it is the Israeli War Cabinet, so long as the War Act is in place, that is maintaining and making the decisions as it relates to the day-to-day operations when it comes to the war. And it's important to note that that cabinet represents what I would argue is mostly a wide swatch of the Israeli consensus, left, right, or center, given how it's been represented, notwithstanding the voices on the hard left and the hard right within Israeli society itself. And I think that that's good. That being said, I think that there is also a desire for an inquiry commission, as we saw after the Yom Kippur War, to kind of take responsibility for the failures of October 7th. And there is no doubt, to my point before, that because Netanyahu is the longest sitting prime minister and all of this came on his watch, where is Israel going next as far as new leadership? And Gantz, for sure, is a runner-up for that role, and he wants that job. Israeli politics, as you know so well, are very fluid, and to say the least. And so it's yet to be seen how this plays out. But for sure, the next few days and months, we will see this playing out, and whether or not there is a actual vote of no confidence, and if there is actually going to be an attempt to dismantle the current government, what that will do. It's a very difficult time to do all of this exactly during a time of war, which is, again, makes it very challenging as a result of the financial burden that is, involved in managing the war in Israel, and then at the same time going for elections. So these are all part of the considerations. And of course, you cannot forget the fact that, to my mind, you're also going to see in the next few months and weeks, for sure, maybe weeks, not even months, the war that Israel is going to have to fight with the North when it comes to Hezbollah. And so the war is far from over. And we need to put that also within the context of the kind of reality Israel is dealing with daily.
You talk about the war being far from over and Israel fighting this war on many fronts. What do you see as the future of the war? Do you think that there's going to be a war with Hezbollah before everything ends? Do you see a normalization agreement coming at any time soon with Saudi Arabia, which is what they're on the verge of doing before 10/7?
I think that there are touch points, but one is not a derivative of the other. I mean, I think that the fallacious argument, to my mind, and the argument that you've heard from some policymakers and even out of the White House, that dealing with Rafah is going to result in Riyadh, they're not on the same playing field. Israel has had, for years now, ties with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, predominantly on military collaboration, again, not full normalization, but really, in particular, as a result of the threat of Iran, the common threat and the common threat that, both Israel and the Saudis understand what Iran represents to the region as the greatest destabilizing force in the region at large, and the threat that they represent to the stability in the region at large. To my mind, if Riyadh and Jerusalem come together, it will be because of their own national interest. That being said, the Saudis have indeed made sympathetic and supportive comments towards the Palestinians and wanting the need to create calm and stability in the region. And I think that, of course, is a larger, goal that they all have. But they do also understand the fact that, the Saudis have been fighting the Houthis on their border with Yemen, and they understand the threats that are coming out of the Muslim Brotherhood and its affiliates, namely Hamas. They understand what Israel is dealing with. And so I think that that's a track that's going to play out, and Israel will continue that track. I think that, policymakers in Washington would like to say that one is inherently linked into the other. I would beg to differ on that point. On the issue of Hezbollah, I think that, Hezbollah is already actively engaged in this war. And Hezbollah, let's not forget, is Iran. And they are pushing and they are continuing the war that Iran began, and they are working in tandem, as they have been working since 10/7, on two fronts, the South and the North. And unless there is consequences, I mean, this all stems from the fact, by the way, cannot be avoided, needs to be said clearly. Our American deterrence when it comes to Iran needs to be very clear. It has direct consequences on how Hezbollah operates. The absence of that lack of clear deterrence and the fact that we have been extremely wishy-washy at best when it comes to sanctions on Iran, the fact that we have been able to release monies to the Iranians, which is directly going now to Hezbollah to fight Israel, I mean, that is insane to my mind. Iran has been hand in hand responsible, has blood, has exactly everything that is happening in the region has Iranian footprints all over it. And so we need to be very clear about that. And in the same vein that Israel believes correctly that it needs to win the war in Gaza, it needs to have the same reality, and it does when it comes to winning the war in the north. Hezbollah is a bit of a different situation in the sense that Israel is going to have to go, if they go and put boots on the ground on an actual state when it comes to Lebanon. Now the attacks have been mostly using the Air Force. But the fact that Hezbollah is continuously breaking every possible UN resolution as far as edging beyond the Litani River, this is the fact that Israel will not stand for that. Those are clear red lines that are broken, and the Israelis, I suspect, are going to move forward to reestablish deterrence. The consequences are very clear. Between the North and the South today, you have close to over 100,000 citizens who have been displaced inside of Israel because of this war on two fronts. And it's only going to escalate.
So we have to acknowledge that we are now in an American election year. What kind of an impact will the war, do you think, have on the matchup between presumably President Biden and former President Trump?
I mean, I think it's going to have consequences. I mean, you're seeing it already play out now as far as the support and comments and the attempt by the Biden administration to try to end the war as soon as possible. I think that they would like to have a so-called political win that, Israel they ended the war during their tenure, depending on whatever happens in November. But like I said, There are many voices in the Democratic Party who have been opposed to the war, have been opposed to Netanyahu. Even Chuck Schumer has made comments about the fact that Netanyahu needs to be removed and meddling with Israeli politics, which I find to be beyond distasteful, meddling with an ally's democratic system. These are problematic issues, to say the least. I mean, the latest comment that it came out about a week and a half ago by the president himself that Hamas, quote, is devastated enough. Any scenario where Hamas is part of the day after tomorrow and has a seat at the table is a failure for the state of Israel. There is no scenario where any government in Israel, whether it be the Netanyahu government or any other government that will come about, that will accept that. The objectives of the war, as were stated and quoted by the IDF at the beginning of this war, was the full dismantlement of Hamas in every way, shape, or form. And when I talk about every way, shape, or form, I'm not talking about just the territory and lower Gaza as far as the tunnels and everything else and removing Hamas, but also the patrons. And so this is all part of this larger war, including the war on American college campuses, which have been part and parcel of the viewpoints that have been sanitizing American society, normalizing anti-Semitism, to basically flip the narrative and argue that Israel can basically do no right and the Palestinians, Hamas, can do no wrong. It is insane, and that needs to shift immediately.
How does this rescue kind of line up next to Biden's recent speech about Hamas has been destroyed enough? And now we're seeing that these 4 kidnappees have been found in the homes of Gazans in the Nusrat refugee camp.
To my viewpoint, I mean, it proves that the Israelis were right, and the arguments that they have made have been correct about the intelligence. I mean, let's put it into context. The reason Israel and the IDF has been successfully able to find the hostages that they've been finding, including the dead bodies that they've been finding over the past few weeks, is a result of the interrogating of Hamas members, of the intelligence that they've gathered, and the execution of, this kind of heroic moves that define what the Israeli military has been able to do in a complicated urban warfare inside of Gaza. I think that the White House should definitely acknowledge this success. I mean, it proves that the Israelis are right, but it also, to my mind, shows that there is a very different timetable that Washington and Jerusalem have, and they may not be aligned. I mean, they're clearly not aligned because, notwithstanding electoral politics and notwithstanding November being as a kind of a bookend time for the Biden administration to get everything in line, or for that matter, maybe August when it comes to the DNC's convention, that's not the timeline of the Israeli war. For Israelis, let's be clear, every day is 10/7. 8 months, since the war began, Americans seem to have forgotten that, and they're already moved on to other considerations. And that, is part of the issue that you're seeing play out here. Let us not forget also, there are still American hostages who are held captive by Hamas in Gaza. There's still 120 that are still in Gaza. Hamas, if it wanted to, could return the hostages, end the war. They could have done all of that. But no, they have been entrenched and embedded in their civilian population. They are using and abusing them, and they are sacrificing whatever it takes in order to mount whatever imagery they need to showcase to the world the awful quote-unquote atrocities of Israel. But the fact of the matter is that this is all part of the theater of propaganda that Hamas has used and abused. And they know that the existence of hostages and the people, Sinwar has surrounded himself by those around him as the lifeline. He's willing to play this game. And this is a part of psychological warfare. And if you ask Hamas's leadership, they will tell you, we yearn and pray for more and more 10/7s. None of this has squashed or has minimized their ideology, their objectives, and their desire for killing of innocent civilians, Americans and Jews alike.
You talk about a timeline. We have to bring up another timeline. It was a few days ago that a video came out from October 7th of terrorists talking about the soldiers from Nachalos, saying these are the women that can get pregnant. We are now passing the 8th month of war, going into the 9th month of war. I know that I probably speak for many women as I was looking at that video of Noa Argamani with her father, trying to see her condition. What do you make of the urgency and the condition of the women that are being held captive?
Look, I think it's horrific. I mean, we have the mounting evidence, and we've seen all the footage in the documentary about the sexual abuse that's happening, the maiming that is taking place. These are horrific events that are taking place. Time is at the essence. Every day that goes by, there is a chance that there's more abuse that's happening. We know that from the evidence. We know that from those who've been released in the first batch. The abuse psychologically, physically, emotionally is unbelievable. And really, to my mind, I've been astonished. Where are the women's group who are screaming and yelling about the sexual abuse that has been happening knowingly in Gaza by Hamas? And this needs to stop. I mean, the world, we need to be screaming and yelling to say, we're, stopping these atrocities. Let's not forget that the Red Cross has never been allowed to go and examine the conditions of the hostages. I mean, Hamas is demanding all these demands, with no reciprocity when it comes to Israelis, elderly, women, children, babies, the Bibas family, which all of us have been following since the 10/7. Again, there has not been enough world outcry rather than world condemnation by institutions like the International Court of Justice, which is basically a kangaroo court, which is all looking to put pressure on Israel. The United Nations, announced the other day that they're putting Israel on the blacklist with groups like Al-Qaeda. It's pathetic. It's insidious. Really, it shows the ongoing detachment of reality, but really trying to showcase Israel in, the worst possible light. While Israel is the only democracy in the region, and the fact that they're giving a pass to designated terrorist organizations, by the way, designated, we should not forget, by the United States, is unbelievable. And this needs to stop. There has to be a clear dose of reality, and to disentangle the propaganda that is being fed by an ignorance by this kind of ongoing ether and this echo chamber of social media and whatever other news outlets are out there, and to actually talk about facts on the ground. No other country has fought a war like Israel has fought in the way they've fought a war like this. We're talking about urban warfare. Let's not forget also that with all the comments that have come out of the Biden administration about the civilian population in Rafah, Israel has been able to disentangle that population and move them to safe zones. When all of the U.S. predictions, well, that's not going to happen, you're not going to be able to do that. Actually, they've been able to do that. And they've been able to prove every assumption that has come out of the White House to be wrong. So that is also quite telling about the conduct and understanding the reality on the ground and what Israel is fighting, to my earlier point. We cannot forget that, and we cannot forget that this is also the war Israel is fighting is also the war that the United States is fighting as well.
Okay, now I know you're a scholar, not a fortune teller, but I still would like to ask you, how long do you predict this will last? How does it end?
Those are good questions. As an historian, I never predict the future. I think that there are similar patterns that we've been seeing here. I mean, look, we got to 10/7 after patterns of attacks of over 20 years that have been consistent attacks by Hamas. The entire southern community of Israel, has felt abandoned by the Israeli government. We saw these attacks consistently since Hamas was elected in 2006. in '08, if going forward. And these missions, what the Israeli military apparatus has called the war between wars that has been ongoing in Gaza, this was the culmination of all of that as a result of this is the war Hamas wanted and yearns for more of. I think that if we do not entirely dismantle the entire infrastructure of Hamas, we will see more of this again. And the pattern will continue, maybe not in 2 years, maybe in 5 years. But that's what's at stake here. And so the Israelis know the pattern. And that cycle needs to break. And by the way, Iran and Iranian proxies, Hamas and others, they had Netanyahu's playbook and they knew what the reaction would be. And so I think that they feel that, that they didn't think Israel would go this far. Because they thought they were going to be able to use all these international institutions to put pressure on the Israelis and to see how the United States would react, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact that it's quite telling when Hamas welcomes the Biden administration's deal versus, the opposition, they see that self as having hope. And that needs to be squashed. The kind of psychological damage. Israel is a scarred nation today, and the level of PTSD that Israel has suffered is insurmountable at this point. And to your point before, we don't know. Every time, the hostages, that are able to be saved and are being brought back, the battery of what needs to happen as far as making sure the abuse that they've gone through, these are the elements that need to be taken into consideration very, very carefully. And it's a reminder that Israel lives in a very dangerous neighborhood. It's a very different neighborhood than it was 30 years ago. The Abraham Accords have been very successful in the sense that you saw after Iran attacked Israel, you saw the Jordanians, the Saudis, all coming together to help Israel. So you're seeing positively state actors that have normalized ties with Israel stepping up, very positive. We need to increase that. But you also cannot forget who the enemies in the region are and what they're capable of doing. And we should take them at their word. They're not lying about what they yearn for. And we've seen the implementation and the validation of all of this since 10/7 and before.
Okay, final question. Who controls the Gaza Strip the day after the war?
That's a very complex situation. I think that until Israel feels that its citizens in the South, and let's not forget that not everybody has returned back to their homes, and whether or not they can psychologically even feel that they can return back to their homes needs to be rebuilt. And that security has been severely broken and compromised. I think that for sure there will be a significant military presence in the area. And the question is going to be about what kind of multinational, international forces are going to be part of the day after tomorrow that Israel and the United States can work with in order to build some kind of trust and calm going forward. There needs to be a lot of rebuilding. It would be useful to have our partners in the region to show, they are collaborating with, the day after tomorrow scenario. But let's not forget that there's not been a lot of pressure on the Egyptians who've been allowing the tunnels to operate. That's the lifeline of Gaza. They've been able to fund Hamas, the training, and without consequences. And Egypt is a ally of the United States and Israel. There's complications with that as well. So we need to think about all of these partners in the region itself. Hamas cannot be at the table in the day after tomorrow situation. And the other partner, to my mind, is UNRWA, the UN Workers Relief Agency for Palestine Refugees, who has been complacent. Actively, their employees, so-called, have been involved in the events, in the barbaric events of 10/7. UNRWA needs to be out of the scene. There needs to be other organizations, whether it's the World and Food Program or other kind of humanitarian agencies to break the monopoly. UNRWA has to be out of the scene as well. But there's going to be a lot of rebuilding. We're not there yet, but these are the open questions that need to be looked at while at the same time, again, going back to my earlier point, safety and security for the Israeli communities of the South is key. The social contract that has been broken between Israeli society and its government as a result of 10/7 is clearly felt throughout the entirety of the state of Israel. And unless we reestablish deterrence, safety, and trust, you're going to see these cycles and patterns continue.
I could talk to you forever. Thank you so much. Asaf Romarowski is with Scholars for Peace in the Middle East and the Association for the Study for the Middle East in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi there. If you made it to the end of this interview and you found it interesting, please subscribe to the channel, like it, interact with the video. It really helps YouTube to show that you're enjoying this content, and it pushes it out to you and to other people. So please subscribe. I did take a look at my analytics, and it shows that a large percentage of the people that are engaging with my channel are not subscribed yet. So if you've watched this long of a video, why not? Go ahead and subscribe, and you'll get more and more of these videos coming your way. And I have a lot planned for this summer. Lots of exciting news to tell you, so make sure that you don't miss a thing. And if you do subscribe, I'll see you later. Thanks. Bye.